Hello and welcome everyone. Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of The Agenda. Today we'll be talking about banking regulation in India and once again bringing to you the core themes that we have been focusing on over the years. We will be discussing the economy as well as the law and how these two areas work hand in hand, how these two fields complement each other. And in the very same context of banking and banking regulation in India, we'll be looking at the role that the Reserve Bank of India plays as a regulator today, as well as the skin in the game, as we've often discussed, or specifically the accountability question, the transparency question as to those people who regulate the banking sector. How is it that they can be made accountable, if at all? And to what extent that accountability and transparency needs to increase? So that would be the core focus of our discussion today. And we have a guest with us, an extremely esteemed professional who has worked extensively in these areas. And before I share his credentials and experience with you, I would get live on our screen Dr. M.R. Venkatesh. A very warm welcome to you, sir.
Namaste. Namaste.
Dr. M.R. Venkatesh is presently practicing as an advocate at the Supreme Court of India and the Madras High Court, and is also a qualified chartered accountant. Right, as is evident from those, the name that appears on the screen. He also holds a PhD, and from all practical purposes, both theoretical and in terms of academic studies, as well as practical experience in terms of his profession, Dr. M.R. Venkatesh is more than qualified to discuss with us the key concepts and the key problems today faced by the banking sector, and specifically look at this issue from the angle of accountability and transparency of banking regulators and the role played by the Reserve Bank of India. A very warm welcome to you, sir. Shall we begin with your broad opening comments on what is the current situation of the regulatory scheme within the banking sector in India? We have the Banking Regulation Act and we have the regulations along with it, as well as the Reserve Bank of India. And what is the present status as to the kind of discretion that is allowed to the bureaucrats and the kind of protection in that sense from any sort of accountability that those who take such decisions enjoy? Your opening comments on that, sir.
Ajay, I would put it this way, that the banking sector or the financial sector in India, which is a very important sector for financial intermediation, which converts your savings into investment, and that solely rests on how good your intermediation is. I would say it is in shambles, and that's putting it mildly. We don't know what to do with banks, and the government thinks it's a question of divesting the banks. And to that extent, I would even agree that's one way forward, but not the only way forward, and that definitely is not a guarantee that the banks will succeed, because Yes Bank was privately managed, Lakshmi Vilas Bank was privately managed, and these two banks collapsed last year. And we don't know how to manage our banks. That's the total of our banking sector today. We don't know what to do with banks. We don't know whether they are to be privately managed, publicly managed. If so, who is to manage? How is it to be regulated? What is the extent of regulation that we should have? And the entire banking sector, the financial sector, banking sector, and that could even extend to the NBFCs. Let me not talk about banking alone. The non-banking financial companies, which is called the shadow banking, which actually fills in the role of a midwife when it comes to lending to certain unbankable sectors, like for example, a pani puri wala or a cycle repair shop, and all those small one car owner who may run a taxi for himself. All those things who may not be typically be bankable by the banking sector norms, but yet are requiring finance and are actually financed by the NBFC. Both these sectors are in absolute shambles. And the price that we paid for this in rupee and our terms is that we have spent 4 lakh crores in recapitalizing banks in the last, say, 4 5 years. 4 lakh crores, only public sector banks. I'm not talking about the loss. I'm not talking about the NPAs. I'm not talking about issues arising, derivative losses. I'm talking only about recapitalization of bank, which has happened because you have not been able to manage the banking sector properly. Partly legacy of the Manmohan Singh government, partly creation of the Modi government also. That today we are seeing laws of recapitalization of around 4 lakh crores, which means, Ajay, if you go to a shop and buy something for 100 rupees and pay 18 rupees GST, it means that probably 1 rupee, 1.5 rupees you are paying to recapitalize banks. And if the banks were performing well, your GST could be as low as 16 rupees or 16%, the median rate.
Yeah.
Instead, it is 18%, probably because 2% the government has to collect more revenue from you and me so that it can fund the banks.
Yes.
So that's the broad macro picture, broad framework on which we must understand the shambles that the banking industry that is in shambles.
Yes. So, Dr. Venkatesh, you said that on some level, this is a problem that has persisted for a while. And at the
Yes.
same time, it is not just that the regulatory framework is such, but also that the consequences of the situation are such that it has a heavy burden. It places a heavy burden on the exchequer itself, on the funds that are to be collected by the government. That a good chunk of it is to go there just to make sure that the system continues to survive, right? Not
Yes.
that to the extent that, okay, they're going to make it grow, but just the requirement of the system to survive gets us to the point where the government is time and again required to intervene. Right? Sure, that we have a difference in terms of the kind of role that the government can play, or let's say the parliament can specifically play, or the union executive could play, versus the role that the RBI is
Yes.
supposed to play or was supposed to play. Right? And that is the core discussion, the core point of our discussion today, that the role of the RBI, right? On some level, we have the traditional school of thought that the government mustn't intervene in the functioning of the RBI, right? And there should be a very broad, hands-free approach in terms of limited supervision, and the RBI can continue to do its work, right? And within the RBI, you have this clash between the economist group versus, let's say, perhaps the bureaucrat group, if I may. It might sound very caricaturist, but within the RBI, historically, we've seen this clash, right, as to who will have control over the larger functioning. Now, a key question that arises as a result of this is that ultimately these will be people who are either have spent their career in the RBI, or sort of, as there's Dr. Rajan, who sort of came in right at the top he entered right through the top, right? He didn't have a career in the RBI per se. Sure, he spent a lot of time at other international institutions and as an economics finance professor and the like. But the idea here is that ultimately any governance structure, we would want always more accountability. We'd want skin in the game on some level when politicians take decisions. And it's not that I'm making a case for the government to now control the RBI, but when politicians make decisions which do not resound with the public, ultimately at some point they will be voted out of office, right? But when it comes to sort of economists and those in the bureaucracy, what happens is there's a certain what we call stability of tenure to some extent, right? At times, okay, fine, an economist can be attached to a particular ministry and they can maybe ask to leave. But what happens, or how should we deal with the problem when people in this RBI or this entire machinery take decisions without even attributing malafide, right? That's a higher, that's a next level argument, and we might get to that as well. But how do you pin responsibility? There is a banker, top of the public sector banking institution, or perhaps at the RBI, they sanction a particular loan to a particular business house. Okay, there is a reason the business could legitimately fail. In some cases, as we've seen that funds have been diverted, right? So obviously, this entire exercise of defrauding the public sector banks and the wealth of the nation, if I may call it that, I think it's quite apt in that sense. The depositors' money, we can sort of directly
Yes.
equate the money with the banks there. And one fine day, by the time this comes to the public, by the time it comes to the media, by the time it comes to the courts, those people are long gone. Most of them are retired.
Yes.
So how is it that we pin accountability? What is the way forward?
Okay. Let me begin by answering this. The long and short of your question is very brilliant. That you are asking for accountability of RBI. As simple as that.
Yes.
We are now facing somewhere around anywhere between 15 lakh crores of our total banking assets, which are in the form of lending to various private companies and various borrowers, run the risk of being labeled as NPA. Now, all NPAs are not Malayas of the world and the Moody's of the world who have looted the bank and gone and settled abroad. There is a good chunk of NPA who became NPA because of a variety of reasons. For instance, I know for a fact that there was a borrower who had put in a terminal in a port to export iron ore. That was a dedicated iron ore export terminal. The day on which he completed the terminal, somewhere around 2011, the Supreme Court banned the iron ore exports. Now, for 4 years, he struggled to see an alternative, and only in 2015 or 16 he could get an alternative of converting that particular export of coal, export of iron ore terminal into an import of coal terminal. Now, these you leave it aside. There could be a road project which starts, land acquisition happens, then some small portion in midway doesn't get acquired, there is a stay, or some other project where the Green Tribunal doesn't approve of it. India, we announce the project, then we go to the drawing board. That's very, very peculiar thing, and that's a huge drain on the your banking sector, and that creates an NPA. So that's secondary. But what is primary is there have been people like Malaya, for instance. Now, I'm not talking about the good, bad, ugly part of it. I'm only putting in a fact that the Kingfisher bird, which was the Kingfisher logo, was offered as a collateral to a bank for a loan of around 800 crores. Now what was the value of the bird? Was arrived at around 800 crores as a collateral. Now, this question that therefore comes in is probably Ajay knew it subsequently, the Economic Times knew it subsequently, the CNBC knew it subsequently. But when did RBI come to know of it, and if so, what has it done? Now, why should RBI know, and what is the relevance here? This is where it becomes crucial. Unlike say SEBI, the Banking Regulation Act, which governs the banks in India, which allows the RBI to become the regulator of the banks in India, and the RBI Act, which allows the RBI to be the regulator for NBFCs in India, both are so constructed to make the RBI a heavy touch regulator, not a soft touch regulator. Which means in several banks, RBI sits on the board, virtually all boards. And you can't get somebody on the board unless the RBI approves of it. The third one, the nominee of the RBI sitting on the board sits on the committee in each bank to disburse large loans. Now, every bank files in over 240 returns. Ajay, I counted it, it's 240. And some of these returns are daily basis, Some are weekly basis, fortnightly basis, monthly basis, quarterly basis, half-yearly basis, annual basis, some as and when they arise. So RBI virtually is the alter ego of bank, and banks are alter ego of RBI. So they are like a Siamese twins out there. They know each other so well, but whenever a fraud happens, and we can list n number of frauds in this country, n number of CBI cases that have been listed against bank officials, n number of cases that have been listed against various other people, and all these people who call so and so as rockstar economists, immediately we label them as, you raise him to a pantheon of gods. We don't critically analyze what is his role, what was his shortcomings, and what he did, what he did not do. And I'm not talking about any particular individual. Let us be clear. We are not talking about individuals. We are talking about the system.
Yes.
And the system is that whenever there is a bank fraud, the top management of the bank is shielded by RBI, because that is your defense for RBI. The best defense for RBI is RBI will be shielding virtually the top management. And I would like to know, how is it that RBI, which is in the know of what is happening in the bank on a real-time basis, has not been investigated for its role? And why is it that the banks have really not looked, or the CBI or any of the investigating agencies, EOW or whichever is the investigating agency, including the Enforcement Directorate, as to what was the role of RBI? Auditors are, now if you take Malaya, which is a poster, Malaya or Nirav Modi, not holding a brief for, they know how to defend, and this case, we are not today, this evening, discussing about them at all.
Yeah.
In Malaya's case, we are going after the auditors, we are going after Malaya, we are going after the independent directors, we are going after the bank, we are going after the independent directors of the bank. But nobody raises a fundamental question. How did this scam happen? How did 800 crores of loan gets lent on the basis of a photograph of a bird? This question, somebody needs to answer from RBI. And unfortunately in our country, the structure of the Banking Regulation Act makes RBI virtually unaccountable to anybody.
Yes, that's true.
Okay. There is a 68th Parliamentary Committee, Standing Committee on Finance, which goes into functioning of banks and NPA. In that, one of the questions posed to the Finance Secretary was something to do with the names of the banks or names of the parties which have defrauded the banks. So the Finance Secretary says, officially, I cannot write to RBI because I don't have the power, and RBI will not give me the information. RBI will not share the information with the Finance Secretary, which means the government of India.
Yes.
And you have created a monolith, you have created a monster, you have created a completely unaccountable body, and whose incompetency, I'm using a rather mild term for which I will seek the apology of your viewers, that the gross negligence and incompetency of RBI cost you and me 4 lakh crores and the minimum in the last 5 years. If the same amount of loss were to be incurred by, say, the finance minister of this country or any other statutory body, all of us would be doing a breast-beating exercise before that office. But RBI, somehow or the other, has become kosher, and nobody wants to question RBI. I have never seen one critical article. Of course, there will be one or two very wonderful exceptions, so forget it. But by and large, I say the rule in the financial media is RBI is kosher, RBI is nothing to be criticized, or no critical article about RBI is to come in. So the time has come that we must put RBI into a microscopic scrutiny.
Yes. I think this gets us to a very interesting point And while I would be doing a disservice to our viewers if I would say, if I wouldn't share with them my most innermost thoughts in this regard, how I'm reminded of Mr. Ron Paul from the United States Congress, who spearheaded the movement uh, to audit the Fed. Sure, there was in a lot of other contexts also monetary policy. While we are not specifically on monetary policy today, and perhaps we'll discuss that at a later stage, but I think some very pertinent points being raised by you here, Dr. Venkatesh, that on some level, everyone has been asked questions, everyone has been sort of made accountable, and everyone can be made accountable. But on some level, we're lacking in the process. You're right. I think both in terms of the RBI Act, sure, there is accountability in that sense to sort of Parliament as an institution, right? But we don't have that system here in India, something similar as to where we have in, let's say, or at least not as robust as we have it in some Western democracies. Let's take the example of the United States Congress, right, where you have committees, standing committees, where you have publicly officials, including the chairperson of the Federal Reserve System, who depose themselves before that committee on the most stringent of questions. This is something that came up during the 2008-9
Crisis.
financial crisis as well. And once again, this is a regular occurrence. This is not something that happens once in a blue. So I think that's one part is certainly there. That there's some requirement in terms of
Ajay,
increased accountability.
Ajay,
Yes,
can
please.
I tell you something?
Yes.
In most advanced countries, there is some sort of an oversight body which meets once in 3 years or 5 years to take stock of the functioning of the regulators. Now, there is a need for us that we must have an oversight body, probably once in 2 years, and gradually ease it to once in 3 years, after say 5, 10 years. And to see to that the functioning of RBI is not put to any permanent body, but a body that meets once in 3 years and takes a stock of the situation of how the RBI functions. Probably next year it can look at how the IRDA functions. That fourth year, third year can look at how the SEBI functions. And all these bodies, have virtually become monoliths. They have become completely out of control. There is no accountability. Some of them lack transparency. Even the most mundane of RTIs are never responded, and virtually it's opaque, it's Stalinist in its functioning. And when grandma's cloak covers, it covers everything, and finally what you find is there is a lot of mud that is getting covered.
Yes, that's true.
So an oversight body, the government has to bring in an oversight body that looks into these financial regulators and must hold adalats, probably all state capitals, at least in the bare minimum, right through the year, so that they get the feedback from several people as to what's happening.
Yes, I think that's very valid. That on some level there has to be some oversight or supervision that's not necessarily, if not necessarily from the government, from some sort of supervision or some sort of supervisory body which looks at it. Not necessarily, I think something that I would definitely agree with, that when these supervisory bodies or regulators become permanent. We've seen the functioning of the CVC and how sort of it's transformed over the years and everything.
And it
The
becomes so
idea,
sarkari. It becomes
sorry,
sarkari and becomes a cheerleader for the government.
precisely the idea being that when these things are temporary,
Yeah,
you can, that's where the real sort of work can happen, or at least there is, when there's no sort of, as we say, stability within that state or that state machinery. That is the only way you can avoid that state within the state, which is to some
correct.
extent what you're saying, that that's what the RBI is moving towards. The very apt word that you use, it's a monolith, right? And that gets me to my next point, Dr. Venkatesh. And we've looked at this from a more broad policy framework angle as to what is the broad problem. But here at the IYA, we ask the hard hitting, pertinent questions and the more relevant ones as well in terms of specific examples, right? And in that sense, we don't mince our words. I want to discuss the specific issue of Lakshmi Vilas Bank, as well as the Section 45 notification under the Banking Regulation Act, the moratorium that comes into place, and post that the amalgamation with DBS Bank. Right. Now, just to give a background, just to give a very brief overview for our viewers here, on some level, there had been talks over the years for DBS to acquire LVB, for there to be other investors coming in. But the most pertinent point that hits me is that just a year before this act was recommended by the RBI and therefore sanctioned by the government, you had the RBI approve of, I will not even get into facilitate, but I don't think that would be entirely incorrect either, new inflow and infusion of capital coming from bond investors, long-term bonds, which the RBI approved. Said, okay, fine, let these long-term bond investors invest in this bank because it requires more capital, and over the long term, this will get better. They will get some return on their money. The bank will be in a healthier spot. And what we see is that within a year of that, the RBI says nothing doing, all value zero, everything transferred to this bank. Now, sure, one cannot help but not mention the fact that there were significant non-performing assets. One cannot say that there were no non-performing assets. Right? The health of the bank is not in discussion here. The merits of that are absolutely separate. Right? I will not even get into that particular angle. But the role of an RBI as a regulator comes into picture here in this particular question, that the RBI, now drawing also from, as you said, right, information coming to the public. I'm reminded of the 2017 judgment of the Supreme Court in Jayanti Lal's case, right, that the RBI has a responsibility to the public and has to share information with the public. This is in the context of that RTI. So the question that arises here is that is RBI's job only to make sure that a big name doesn't disappear into thin air in terms of depositors still gaining their money or still keeping their money, if I may, but at the same time they say, listen, there's a group of investors, small investors, people who think, okay, RBI is saying go ahead with these bonds, right? They put in their money, and then suddenly one fine day they say equity, bonds, debentures, whatever, everything is zero. You get nothing out of it. Sure, for our viewers, this is a matter that's pending litigation. It's before multiple high courts. It's before the Supreme Court. I'm not getting into that, but the questions before the court at this point, because it's not our place to. But the role of the RBI as a regulator here, like what were they doing? What were they thinking? What was the rationale behind this? They can't be justified in terms of sound policy in any way.
Okay. ILFS, S Bank, Lakshmi Vilas Bank, all these are forming part of a horror story that is unfolding before us. And it is not that RBI, forget what the RBI knew and did not know from the banks, the returns, the official communications, correspondences, forget it for a moment. Lakshmi Vilas Bank was sinking and sinking and sinking and sinking, and it was public knowledge. The shenanigans of Rana Kapoor qua S Bank was market gossip in all pubs, in all five-star hotels, in all bar rooms. Everybody knew it. It was common knowledge. Only LKG student did not discuss that. Everybody was discussing in Mumbai how to get a loan from S Bank and what is the route. Route is to use Rana Kapoor and his large-heartedness. Large-heartedness within quote. Now, ILFS. The ILFS saga was unfolding before us for almost 3-4 years. Everybody was talking about the stench that was emanating from the books of ILFS. And in all the three, like the police who comes in the last scene of a Hindi movie and says, "Koi hilna nahi." The RBI comes at the fag end and says that I'm issuing an order under Section 45. Now, how far is it tenable? What have you done till date? You see the whole thing falling right through from 38,000 feet to zero. You can't act when the plane hits the ground and say, I am taking an action under Section 45 and send the ambulance and the fire engines to quell the fire. Now, let me take the case of Lakshmi Vilas Bank. Lakshmi Vilas Bank, RBI suddenly decides that this bank has to undergo moratorium on 17th November 2020. That is on a Tuesday night. And it says, give me all your objection to it by the end of Friday within 71 hours. It says by 5 p.m. of Friday. And
Yes,
Monday,
absolutely.
team is ready and approved. And it is given to DBS Bank. Now it's bewildering that how can you pick and choose DBS? What was the basis? Now Caesar's wife has to be above suspicion. I am not accusing anybody of being corrupt here, but for a regulator to pick and say that this is what I would like it to happen, and say this is like a beauty contest. I would like LVB to be absorbed by DBS, and the ostensible reason given by RBI was DBS has got the financial muscle to manage Lakshmi Vilas Bank. But Ajay, you will be surprised. Again, last week or a fortnight back, the same RBI says it has opened a window of 7,000 crores or 6,000 crores for DBS to manage the LVB. Now, if LVB could not be absorbed by DBS all by itself and the RBI had to step in, why not RBI step in the first instance and give the same 6,000 crores to LVB?
Absolutely.
The second thing, very important. Now, if all these loans are basically NPAs without malafide, and these are all genuine NPAs in the sense there is nobody who has looted the bank, but these have become NPAs and consequently sunk the bank, then doesn't it all reflect very poorly on Narendra Modi's policies, economic policies? On one hand, we say we are going and jumping in ease of business. On one hand, we are saying that we are now Atmanirbhar Bharat. On one hand, we are saying we are in the highway to growth. And the other way, we are also seeing banks after banks sinking and no action being taken on any of the promoter or directors of the bank. I didn't see any action, coercive action on the board of directors of Lakshmi Vilas Bank. That means they did their job properly, they lent properly, they carried on with all due diligence, but the events in the economy overtook them and the bank actually went belly up. Is this the case? Is RBI indirectly saying that it is not the bank that was mismanaged, but the economy was mismanaged? Or is it a case that the bank was mismanaged, the economy is perfectly managed? Take Rana Kapoor's example. Yes, Bank. You wanted to have one example, I'm giving you three.
Yeah.
Now, Rana Kapoor's example, everybody knows his link with PMC is now coming out. His link with Devan Housing is coming out. People are talking about kickbacks in various loans. Now, how is it that the RBI did not know about it? How is it that various loans to various and to Jet Airways and other banks, other financial institutions and companies which are themselves a dubious track record? Again, Jet Airways, we all know from 2012 or 2013, it was going belly up. Yes. Excepting RBI, which was monitoring Yes Bank account. And Yes Bank was lending to all these institutions. So the question is the competency of RBI in managing the banks as a regulator. And it is now previously we used to say it is Malya scam. We used to say Nirav Modi scam. And for the last 2 years, we are saying Yes Bank scam, Lakshmi Vilas Bank scam, PMC scam. We are talking about institutional scams. Scams are now no longer remaining with one promoter or two. Now scams is endemic and it has reached an epidemic stage. And I'm sorry to say it will reach a pandemic stage also. And that is no longer limited to Ajay or MR Venkatesh. It is now setting upon institution after institution after institution. That means RBI is the villain of the piece. RBI has to be held guilty. RBI has to be made accountable. RBI has to be subjected to investigation. RBI officials have to be put through serious investigation by SFIO or CBI or any of the EOWs that are investigating this scam. And we need to find out why is it that institutions after institutions are failing, financial institutions after financial institutions are failing.
Absolutely.
And unless we set this in order, I'm sorry to say that our dreams of some 8%, 10% growth is not going to happen, and RBI's lack of competency is derailing our growth path very bad. It's derailing us very bad.
Yes. So those are some very, very pertinent points, Dr. Venkatesh. And on some level, it's absolutely necessary that for growth at large, the capital flows, which we get not just from the banking sector, but as well as from the NBFCs, must be kept flowing. And for there to be more investment flowing from other parts of the world, there has to be a certain sense of trust. Trust comes from predictability, it comes from a certain sense of stability. And stability, not in the sense that there is continuance of a bad policy, but stability in the sense that, okay, this is what's clean, right? These are the norms, they are well established. We give, as students of law, we're taught about the rule of law, right? The rule of law is not necessarily that there will be a regulation, but well, laws have to be clear. They might be general, but they have to be specific in particular context, such as this.
They have to be,
And
they have to be
applied
functional.
uniformly.
They have to be functional.
Yes, absolutely.
They cannot be ornamental piece in the statute books. Especially the regulatory law has to be functional and it has to be demonstrably functional.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's what is not happening.
No, I think it's a very valid point, and that's what gets me to the last strand of discussion that we're having. That on some level, we still have laws in the country, and sure, this is something that's a generic point about other sectors as well. But specifically, banking regulation and specifically the functioning of the RBI, the law as it stands still gives them a lot of discretion. Right. And this is something that is not exclusively within the domain of setting monetary policy or regulation of banking. Right. This is something that extends across the leviathan that is the Indian bureaucratic state. Right. So that is something separate. We're not getting into the generic aspect of it. But coming specifically to the kind of discretion enjoyed, right? Taking the example of the invocation of Section 45 this last November, as you had pointed out. Now we look at the to borrow from a certain loud and well-established anchor, the sheer suddenness of the move, right? On a light-hearted note, the sheer suddenness, as he said, right? It was, as you said, right? This is just happening overnight. Within days, you decide that we will wipe off wealth that came into this particular system by our own approval or our own sanction just a few months ago.
And to whitewash our own sins.
To
whitewash our own sins. That's the most important thing.
Absolutely. Yes. So that's the point, right? That on some level, yes, we need laws that are functional. But would you also be willing to comment that there is also a need to not just sort of bring in new laws, but to remove those older laws or presently existing laws that give this kind of discretion to the central bank and largely sort of people who sit atop that system? Because where there is discretion, and we say absolute discretion is students of administrative law, that absolute discretion is what leads to tyranny. Right. These are not my words. These are the likes of the great jurists and all. Right. Absolute discretion is equivalent to tyranny. But that is the kind of power that was exercised, right? I'm not saying that there might not have been reasons. We're saying that we're not discussing the merits and the health of the bank or any bank for that matter. But there is wide power. There's a wide power. It is absolutely discretionary. And perhaps that is something that requires some sort of amendment, that power needs to be curbed. The world as we know it today is moving towards decentralized finance, right? At a time where the likes of the dollar and the Federal Reserve and the hegemony of central banking is being challenged by institutions such as Bitcoin, right? That's a topic for another day. But don't you think that it is time that India too considers? It's been about 90 years since the RBI Act was brought in, right? And about 8 odd decades since the Banking Regulation Act. Don't you think it's time that those powers are reduced and we move more towards a localized, decentralized model of governance in terms of banking? Do you think that that is a viable way forward?
Okay, there are two questions in your question.
Yes.
The first limb is what are the powers of RBI and whether we need to decentralize or rejig it. I would use the word rejig rather than the word decentralized because a central bank cannot be decentralized. So that would be an oxymoron by itself. So be that as it may, the first one is RBI monitors you, appoints auditors. It has its own auditors. It sits on the board. It sits on the committee. Its representative sits on the board. Its representative sits on the committee, which is disbursing large loan. It gets information on the real-time basis. It can issue direction. It can seek information. It's the MyBab of all MyBabs. So let's be very clear. Now, it can do anything like what it did with S Bank. It can do what it did with Lakshmi Vilas Bank. It has got extraordinary powers under 45. It can seek any type of information. It can sack any person. It can bring in any person. No, the powers are literally wide. But the RBI is the last person to know of a bank which is sinking. So obviously, it's a no-brainer that the whole act has to be revisited. Probably it is of the 1935 vintage or around that time. And probably the Banking Regulation Act and the RBI Act has to be revisited. We cannot be allowing the RBI to degenerate, and it is degenerating very fast. I don't know why in the entire financial system the alarm bells have not yet been rung. Why is it the Prime Minister's office is not intervening? Why is it the Finance Minister is not talking about the dysfunctional RBI in her budget speech? Why is it that the opposition not want to comment on the RBI's failure? Why is it that there is no calling attention motion in the parliament about the RBI's functioning? Why is it that the JPC is not called on for an RBI? And in this, let us be very clear, there is no tutu mai in this. It is not your RBI versus my RBI. It is not a secular RBI versus a communal RBI. It is the RBI of the country. And let us all come together, not to criticize it, but to criticize it with a very clear objective of making it functional. Today, what is RBI is basically a dysfunctional institution which takes all records from you and puts it in the cold storage, albeit digitally. So it doesn't. It literally takes it and puts it. All these are digital cold storage. So RBI, somewhere down the line, you are very right. Though your phraseology may be slightly off mark in the terms of decentralization, we may have to do a complete rejig of RBI in terms of the experience of the last 15, 20 years. And ask a question, why is it that the RBI is the last man to arrive at any crisis? Why is it that the RBI unable to do what it is supposed to do? And a robust RBI, a RBI which functions on a real-time basis, RBI which intervenes almost on a daily basis in the functioning of the bank, or should we have an RBI which is hands-on? In fact, you will be surprised. RBI made a commitment to the Parliament in 2017 that it will withdraw independent its own appointees and nominees in the board of the banks. That was a promise made by RBI to the Parliament. but yet it has not been able to keep up. The reason for it is obvious. It's the perks of office. And I believe, though I have no direct evidence, but I think the only thing that the nominees of the RBI sit on the board and decide whether to have cashew nut or badam, whether to have tea or coffee, whether to have the next meeting in Shimla or in Uti, so that they can go and have a good paid holiday in these places, hill stations. I don't see that RBI's nominees are bringing value to the table. There is something seriously wrong, whether it is the law or whether it is the person. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is, you collectively have paid 4 lakh crores to recapitalize banks. And I demand now, as a taxpayer institution, accountability.
Absolutely, absolutely. That was the point on which we began this conversation. That was our aim today, to discuss how is it that we reach there. Dr. Venkatesh, we have come to the close of this discussion. I've been told that we have a 45-minute deadline. So
Yeah.
once again, we hope to obviously continue the conversation on the RBI, other financial and legal issues at a later date. But for at least today, as we bring this discussion to a close, thank you so much for joining us here at the IYA. It was indeed a pleasure having hosted you. And I'm sure that our audience, we're getting in a lot of comments, and we obviously don't have the time to bring all of them up on the screen. But certainly, our audience is we hope that they've had this discussion has been fruitful for our audience in terms of getting some insights regarding the issue that we discussed today. So, Dr. Venkatesh, thank you so much once again for joining us. And we hope that we'll have you on our podcast sometime in the near future once again. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Good evening.